if you ask the average person who owns America's $40 trillion national debt, they'll probably tell you it's China.
Right. Or some shadowy group.
Yeah, like some international bankers or a hidden government vault somewhere. But the reality is far more surprising, and honestly, it's a lot more personal.
Yeah.
Because the entity holding the vast majority of that astronomical record-breaking debt might just be you.
It is a profound misconception. You
Yeah.
know, people hear a number like 40 trillion, which, by the way, the U.S. national debt officially crossed in August of 2026.
Right.
And their brains just shut down. It becomes this total extraction.
It's today.
Exactly. We stop processing it as actual money with actual consequences, and we start mythologizing it. I mean, we invent stories to explain away something that just feels too massive to comprehend.
So today, we are stripping away that mythology. We have a source document that takes this $40 trillion reality and just rips it open. We are going to completely demystify the exact anatomy of this debt, you know, who holds the bag, how the mechanics work, and where your money fits into it. But the source doesn't stop at a financial audit. It takes these hard numbers and connects them to this massive systemic theory about where our society is heading. It makes the case that this crushing debt burden is actually the central engine driving fears of authoritarian control, the loss of our personal agency, and the deployment of uncontrollable artificial intelligence.
And we are diving into some really intense territory today.
Yeah.
The text we're analyzing references some highly charged concepts. It discusses things like communist tyranny, the actions of quote-unquote elites, and it directly examines these internet narratives like the X-22 theory.
Right.
And as we unpack these ideas, I think it's crucial to state that we are doing so as impartial analysts.
Right.
We're looking at the mechanics of these arguments. We just want to understand the underlying logic the author is using and see how the financial data either supports or contradicts those broader claims.
Exactly. We're not validating or endorsing any political framing here. We're just looking at the machinery of the argument. So, okay, let's unpack this. Starting with the math.
The math, yeah.
$40 trillion is a terrifying number on a headline, but the Treasury Department doesn't just dump it all into one giant spreadsheet, right? They divide this debt into two very specific buckets. The first one is called intragovernmental holdings, and as of late August 2026, this sits at about $7.75 trillion.
Right.
So that's roughly a fifth of the total debt.
Yeah, about 20%. And that term, intragovernmental, it essentially means the government owes that money to itself.
Oh.
It is Treasury securities sitting in other federal accounts.
Yeah.
So the heavyweights in this category are things like the Social Security Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund, various military and civil service retirement funds, and the Medicare trust funds.
So mechanically, this is like me writing an IOU to myself, like moving it from my left pocket to my right pocket and then spending the cash.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
So let's take Social Security as an example just so I can wrap my head around this. When I pay my payroll taxes, that money goes to the government.
Right.
And for decades, the government collected more in Social Security taxes than it actually paid out to retirees.
Right.
It had a surplus.
A massive surplus, yeah.
So it took that surplus cash, spent it on other things like the military or highways or whatever, and replaced the cash with an IOU, like a special treasury bond, inside the Social Security Trust Fund.
Exactly. And that system works perfectly fine as long as you have more workers paying in than retirees taking money out.
Right.
Because that surplus provides this steady stream of incredibly cheap funding for the rest of the government.
But then demographics shift.
Yeah, the baby boomer generation retires en masse. And suddenly, that left pocket, the Social Security Trust Fund, it actually needs the cash back to pay out the benefits.
Oh, wow. But the cash is gone.
It's gone. It was spent decades ago. All that is left are those IOUs.
So wait, is this essentially like writing an IOU to yourself, putting it in your left pocket and spending the cash from your right pocket? But when that left pocket, like Social Security, needs the cash back, you suddenly have to go ask the neighborhood for a loan.
Yes, is exactly it. Which means the Treasury has to figure out how to make good on those IOUs. They can't just, digitally print the money out of thin air without causing massive inflation.
Right.
So they have to go out into the real world, to the actual financial markets, and borrow real cash to pay the retirees. Which brings us to the second, vastly more important bucket of debt.
Okay, what's the second bucket?
The second bucket is debt held by the public.
Yeah.
And this is the monster. We are looking at approximately $32.3 trillion.
Wow.
Yeah. It takes up the remaining 81% of the total debt pie. And this represents every single treasury bond, bill, and note owed to an entity outside the federal government's internal ledger.
The source notes that when economists or bond traders or central bankers talk about the national debt, they almost exclusively focus on this $32.3 trillion figure, right? They essentially ignore that intergovernmental left pocket, right pocket stuff.
They do, yeah, because the public debt represents real-world financial gravity.
What do you mean by gravity?
Well, when the U.S. Treasury issues a bond into the public market, it is absorbing actual capital. So imagine a brilliant tech startup trying to raise $1 billion to build a new semiconductor factory.
Okay.
They go to the capital markets looking for investors. But the U.S. Treasury is also there, asking for $1 billion to fund the government's daily operations.
Right, and they're competing.
Exactly. But the Treasury offers a guaranteed risk-free return. The startup is risky. So a huge chunk of investment capital flows to the government instead of the private sector.
Oh, I see.
Economists call this crowding out. The larger that $32.3 trillion number gets, the more capital it sucks out of the productive economy just to keep the government lights on.
Okay, so if the public holds 80% of this astronomical number, we need to get very specific about who, quote unquote, the public is.
Definitely.
Because the narrative out there, the conspiracy theory mindset, it assumes the debt is held by some untouchable elite class, completely divorced from normal society.
Right.
But let's look at the actual major players here, starting with the Federal Reserve. As of mid-August 2026, the Fed holds about $4.54 trillion of this public debt.
Yeah, and for Treasury accounting purposes, the Federal Reserve is considered a separate entity from the federal government. They interact in the open market. So the Fed buys Treasury securities to inject liquidity into the banking system, which, lowers interest rates.
Oh.
But what's fascinating here is that the source points out a crucial shift. That $4.54 trillion is actually down significantly from its peak just a few years ago.
Right, because of quantitative tightening. Right. The Fed has been actively shrinking its footprint.
Exactly. The mechanism of quantitative tightening is brutal, but, according to them, necessary for fighting inflation.
How does it actually work? Like, do they just sell the bonds?
No, actually. Instead of actively selling the bonds they hold, the Fed simply lets them mature.
Okay.
When a Treasury bond matures, the government pays the principal back to the bondholder, which in this case is the Fed. Normally, the Fed would take that cash and just buy a new bond, rolling the debt over.
Right. Keep the party going.
Yeah. But under quantitative tightening, the Fed takes the cash and simply deletes it from the financial system. They just destroy the reserves.
Wait, they just delete the money?
Literally delete it from their balance sheet. And this forces the Treasury to find new buyers for that debt in the private market, which pushes interest rates higher.
That is wild. Okay, which brings us to the foreign buyers. Because this is the ultimate political talking point, right? You hear it in every single election cycle. China owns us. But when we look at the data for this $9.3 trillion foreign slice, which is about 30% of the public debt, the actual leaderboard is highly counterintuitive.
It really is. I mean, China is not the largest holder, and they haven't been for a long time. Based on the figures leading into mid-2026, Japan is the largest foreign holder at over $1.1 trillion.
Wow.
The United Kingdom is second at roughly $940 billion. China is third, down near $630 billion. And then rounding out the top list are places like Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Cayman Islands.
Wait, Luxembourg and the Cayman Islands, they aren't exactly economic superpowers running massive trade surpluses. Why are they holding hundreds of billions in U.S. treasuries?
This is where we have to separate foreign central banks from foreign private capital. A huge portion of this foreign bucket isn't foreign governments trying to gain political leverage over America. It is just private global wealth. The Cayman Islands, Belgium, Luxembourg, these are major global financial clearinghouses and banking centers.
Right. Tax havens and fund centers.
Exactly. If a European pension fund, or let's say a Middle Eastern sovereign wealth fund, wants to hold U.S. dollars safely, they buy treasuries through accounts based in these financial hubs. So it gets recorded as foreign ownership, but it's really just the plumbing of global finance looking for a safe yield.
Okay, that makes sense. And even for countries like Japan or China, their ownership isn't necessarily some aggressive master plan, right? It's a mechanical byproduct of the global trade system. Like if you go to a dealership in the U.S. and you buy a Japanese car, those dollars flow to Japan. The Japanese automaker takes those dollars and pays their workers in yen. But the Japanese central bank now has a mountain of U.S. dollars. What do they do with them? They can't just stuff billions of physical bills in a vault. They need an asset that pays interest, is perfectly safe, and can absorb massive amounts of capital. The U.S. Treasury market is basically the only market on Earth big enough to handle that.
That dynamic is the lifeblood of the U.S. dollar's reserve currency status. I mean, the world runs trade surpluses with the United States, accumulates dollars, and then recycles those dollars back into U.S. treasuries, which funds our government deficit. It is a massive structural loop.
So we have the Fed holding about 14%. We have foreign governments and global private wealth holding roughly 30%. That leaves the majority, over half of this $32.3 trillion public debt, sitting right here at home, held by domestic, private, and public investors.
And this is the crux of the intermediation that the source text focuses on. The biggest single domestic category is not, individual citizens buying paper savings bonds.
Right.
It is mutual funds and money market funds, followed by commercial banks, state and local government pension funds, insurance companies, and finally, a bucket of households and hedge funds.
This breakdown completely dismantles the X-22 narrative that the source brings up. There are all these fringe internet commentaries claiming the national debt is structurally separate from the general public. They frame it as a liability belonging to the system, or some corporate elite layer, shielding the average citizen from any real exposure.
The official numbers, which are pulled straight from Treasury fiscal data, show that the public absolutely does hold this debt. The connection is just intermediated.
So when you look at your 401k statement, when you put cash into a high-yield savings account, or when you pay your life insurance premium, you are the one funding this massive system.
Yes.
The bank takes your deposit, and because regulations require them to hold safe assets, they take your money and they buy U.S. Treasuries. You own the debt. You just hired a professional manager, like a mutual fund, a bank, a pension board, to hold it for you.
It's a foundational market structure fact. Direct retail ownership exists, sure, but it's totally dwarfed by these massive institutional holdings. Your financial well-being, your retirement, is inextricably tethered to the performance and stability of those treasury bonds.
But I want to explore the psychology of this for a moment, because I think the author of the source text actually sympathizes with the people who feel disconnected from this reality.
Oh, absolutely.
If you don't personally have a pile of treasury bonds sitting in a brokerage account that you actively manage, and all this money is moving through complex mutual funds and distant banking institutions, it makes total sense that you feel no ownership over it.
Yeah.
I think people confuse the legal ownership of the debt with a profound frustration over fiscal representation, like feeling like they didn't vote for the spending.
That is a critical distinction.
Right.
Saying, I didn't authorize this $40 trillion in spending, my politicians completely failed me, and I want no part of it. That is a completely valid argument about fiscal policy and political alienation.
You can mentally categorize the debt as belonging to someone else because you feel unrepresented.
But that political frustration does not alter the harsh economic reality. You can be as angry at the system as you want, but your pension is still legally carrying that debt. And the danger of narratives like the X-22 claim is that they treat the structure of modern finance, the fact that ownership is concentrated to professional managers, as proof of a conspiracy. It provides this false comfort, right?
Yeah.
A belief that if the system crashes, only the elites will get hurt.
But the math shows the exact opposite.
Exactly. If the treasury market fractures, the contagion rips straight through Main Street's retirement accounts.
So if we are the ones holding this debt, we have to ask the terrifying question, what happens when it becomes too heavy to carry?
Yeah.
Our source document pivots from this purely financial audit into a broader geopolitical analysis. It explores the theory that this immense debt burden is dragging us toward an interconnected triad of threats, a debt spiral, authoritarian centralization, and AI beyond human control.
It sounds like an enormous leap, right?
Yeah.
Going from mutual fund accounting directly into dystopian political theory can feel super jarring.
Yeah, it feels like quite a jump.
But the author does a remarkable job of grounding these anxieties in historical and systemic logic. The connective tissue between a massive national debt and political tyranny is a concept the text calls slack.
Slack. Okay, let's really drill down into this because it seems like it's the key to understanding the rest of the document. What exactly is systemic slack?
Think of slack as a nation's financial breathing room. It's the shock absorber.
Okay.
When a government has low debt relative to the size of its economy, it has enormous slack.
Yeah.
If a war breaks out or a pandemic hits or the banking sector collapses, the government can easily borrow $1 trillion at very low interest rates to flood the system with cash and solve the crisis without breaking a sweat.
The buffer is thick.
Exactly. But the source points out that the U.S. public debt is now roughly 100% of our gross domestic product. That means the debt is the exact same size as the entire output of the U.S. economy for a full year. And more importantly, the cost of carrying that debt has skyrocketed. Interest expense is no longer a rounding error. It is a first-tier budget item, competing with defense and Medicare.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because it's like a family whose credit card balance has grown so massive that just paying the minimum monthly interest consumes half their paycheck.
Yes.
Suddenly, they have no slack. If the car breaks down or the roof leaks, they are facing instant catastrophe because there is no room left to borrow and no cash left in the checking account.
And when a nation loses its financial slack, the government is forced into brutal zero-sum choices. And history shows us exactly how governments behave when they are pushed into this corner. Look at Weimar Germany in the 1920s.
Right.
They were burdened with massive, unpayable war reparations, essentially an external debt they just couldn't service. They had zero financial slack. So they resorted to money printing, which destroyed the currency, wiped out the middle class, and created the exact conditions for extreme authoritarianism to take root.
Or look at a less extreme but highly relevant example like the United Kingdom and the United States right after World War II. Both countries were drowning in debt from fighting the war. They had to figure out how to shrink that debt burden without defaulting.
And their solution was a mechanism called financial repression. This is a term the source text warns about, and it's vital to understand the mechanics of it. Financial repression is essentially a stealth tax on savers.
How does the government pull that off? Like, how does a stealth tax actually work?
They force interest rates to stay artificially low, often way lower than the rate of inflation. So at a free market, if inflation is running at, say, 8%, bond investors will demand an interest rate of at least 9 or 10% to protect their purchasing power.
Sure, you wouldn't lend money just to lose value on it.
Right. But under financial repression, the government steps in. The central bank caps the yield on government bonds at, say, 2.5%. Then, regulators pass rules forcing commercial banks, pension funds, and insurance companies to hold a large percentage of their assets in these low-yielding government bonds, classifying them as safe liquid assets.
Wait, so if inflation is at 8% and you are forcing my pension fund to hold bonds paying 2.5%, you are legally guaranteeing that I lose 5.5% of my purchasing power every single year.
Yes.
The value of my savings is being quietly incinerated to melt away the real value of the government's debt.
It is a massive wealth transfer from private citizens to the state. And here is where the source connects the loss of slack to the second prong of the triad, authoritarian centralization.
Okay.
Because implementing policies like financial repression, or imposing massive new taxes, or gutting social benefits, that creates intense societal friction. Yeah. People don't want their wealth confiscated.
Right, they look for exit doors.
Exactly. They try to move their money offshore or into alternative assets like gold or crypto.
Which means the state, desperately needing to keep capital trapped inside the system to fund itself, starts reaching for new levers of control. It becomes a matter of survival. The state becomes dependent on continuous market access, and if the market stops cooperating voluntarily, the state has to force cooperation.
And the text lists the specific mechanisms of this control. It talks about the surveillance of flows and the control of payment rails.
Payment rails being like the plumbing, right?
Yeah, the underlying plumbing of the financial system. Yes, the SWIFT network, the clearinghouses, the credit card processors. If you control the rails, you control who is allowed to participate in the economy.
Which brings up the push for central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. If the government replaces physical cash with a fully digital, programmable currency managed directly by the central bank, they have ultimate control over the payment rails.
Ultimate control.
They could literally program the money to expire if you don't spend it fast enough, or block you from buying certain assets if they want to trap your capital in government bonds, like stimulus checks that vanish in 30 days if you don't stimulate the economy.
Right. And whether the source text labels this behavior communist, Leninist, or an emergency managerial state, the underlying mechanism is identical. A state stripped of its financial slack will naturally seek to centralize power to manage the crisis. The text points to China as the clearest, most advanced example of this technological control stack in existence today.
Right.
China has integrated absolute political party control with digital identity systems, social credit monitoring, and aggressive industrial policy where the state picks the winners and losers.
And to be clear, the author isn't saying the United States is literally turning into a carbon copy of the Chinese Communist Party overnight.
No, not at all.
They are arguing that when any government, regardless of its founding ideology, is pushed to the absolute brink by a debt spiral, that specific toolkit of centralized control starts looking incredibly attractive.
It stops being about ideology and starts being about cold, hard pragmatism to prevent a sovereign default.
So this transition into technological control perfectly sets up the third pillar of the triad: artificial intelligence beyond human control.
Yeah.
When people hear AI beyond human control, they immediately jump to science fiction. They picture Terminator robots marching down the street or a supercomputer launching nuclear weapons.
Right, the Hollywood versions.
Yeah, but the source text explicitly pulls the conversation away from that. It splits the AI risk into two distinct, non-dystopian, highly practical categories. The first is a quote-unquote loss of steering.
A loss of steering simply means that technology is evolving and improving at a pace that vastly exceeds the speed of human institutions.
Okay.
Our regulatory bodies, our legal systems, our congressional committees, these institutions were built to operate at the speed of the 20th century. By the time a committee spends 2 years drafting a piece of legislation to regulate an AI model, the private tech labs have already released a model 3 generations more advanced, rendering the laws completely obsolete.
The ship is moving too fast for the steering wheel to connect to the rudder.
Exactly.
The second risk they highlight is far more immediate to the average listener, I think. It's the loss of agency for people. This isn't about AI taking over by force. It's about a quiet, invisible displacement. We are talking about severe labor disruption, algorithms capturing human attention and shaping public sentiment, and most insidiously, automated decision-making.
This is where AI merges with the authoritarian control tools we just discussed. Imagine a financial system reliant on programmable digital currencies and strict capital controls. Human bureaucrats couldn't possibly monitor billions of microtransactions in real time to enforce compliance.
No way.
But an AI system can.
Oh, I see. So if a machine learning algorithm is deciding whether you get approved for a mortgage or whether your business gets access to the payment rails or what political information shows up in your feed, and that system is completely hidden inside a corporate or government black box, you have lost your agency.
Completely.
Yeah.
There is no human being to appeal to. You can't vote an algorithm out of office if it decides your financial behavior doesn't align with the state's goals.
So the author weaves these three threats, debt, tyranny, and AI, together into a vicious interlocking loop. It starts with the sheer pressure of the $40 trillion debt. That pressure creates an intense existential demand for two things: explosive economic growth to try and outgrow the debt burden, and strict societal control to manage the fallout as financial slack disappears.
And artificial intelligence happens to be the ultimate perfect tool to provide both of those demands simultaneously. I mean, it is a massive potential growth engine that could revolutionize productivity. And it is an unprecedented control engine that can monitor and manage a population with perfect efficiency.
But the danger of the loop works like this, right? Whoever masters the AI control engine first can use it to lock in a specific political order.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, if an authoritarian faction or simply a desperate managerial state can implement these AI-driven financial and social controls while the fiscal window is still open, meaning before the debt spiral completely implodes the economy, they can make reversing that political order practically impossible.
Wow.
Digitized finance and automated enforcement raise the cost of rebellion or reform to a level the public simply can't afford.
And the source compares how this race is playing out on the global stage. It notes that China is running a version of this loop intentionally. They're actively and aggressively integrating AI into their control tech stack to ensure the state survives whatever economic turbulence is coming. But how does the text describe the Western approach to this triad?
It describes the Western situation as a messier version by default. We don't have a singular, coordinated master plan executed by a central committee.
Thank goodness.
Right, but instead we have a dangerous convergence of uncoordinated trends. We have politicians hooked on massive deficit spending. We have an administrative state that naturally seeks to expand its regulatory reach. We have private Silicon Valley AI labs racing ahead of all legal constraints in pursuit of profit. And we have global financial markets that stubbornly treat U.S. treasuries as the ultimate safe asset, which continuously enables the debt expansion.
So we are stumbling into the exact same trap, just without a blueprint.
Basically, yeah.
Let me see if I can put an analogy to this, because holding all these macroeconomic and technological forces in your head at once is difficult. It's not a simple equation where debt automatically equals communism or AI is inherently evil. The dynamic is more like a race.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine we are standing at the bottom of a massive mountain. On one track, slowly but inevitably sliding down toward us, is an avalanche. That avalanche is the compounding math of the national debt. It is heavy, it is mathematically relentless, and it crushes all the slack out of the system as it descends.
I like this.
On the other track, racing up the mountain from the bottom, is a massive, high-tech snowplow. That snowplow represents AI-driven productivity and economic growth.
Right.
The ultimate existential question is this. Can the AI snowplow arrive fast enough and generate enough incredible wealth to clear away the avalanche of debt before the sheer panic of the impending avalanche forces the government to use the AI technology as a weapon to lock us all inside the cabin and ration our food?
That is a great visual. And taking that snowplow analogy further, the source asks whether the outcome of this race is truly irreversible. The initial framing of the text heavily leaned on that word, but the author actually argues strongly against the idea of inevitability. Path dependence is not the same thing as fate.
Right. The debt paths can be altered. It involves immense pain through inflation, severe spending restraint, or explicit restructuring of the debt. But painful is not the same as impossible.
And political centralization can also stall or reverse. The text notes that centralized power grabs usually happen late in a crisis, and they're incredibly expensive to maintain socially and economically. Tyranny is not a permanent, unchangeable state of nature. It is a fragile system that requires constant energy to enforce.
That's a really good point.
And even with the rapid advancement of artificial intelligence, the source reminds us of the physical constraints grounding this technology. AI capabilities might outrun our slow-moving regulatory institutions, but they cannot outrun the laws of physics.
We're talking about energy and hardware.
Exactly. Training a massive next-generation AI model requires an astonishing amount of electricity. It requires physical data centers, complex zoning permits, and access to local power grids.
You can't just build that in a vacuum.
No, and it requires a highly fragile global supply chain for advanced semiconductor chips, specifically from places like TSMC in Taiwan. And on top of the hardware limits, basic legal liability rules still act as massive speed bumps for deployment.
The goal, according to the conclusion of the text, is not to throw our hands up and accept dystopian doom as a foregone conclusion. The goal is an active political project of maintaining optionality.
Maintaining optionality while the options still exist on the table. We need fiscal optionality, forcing debates about spending and debt restructuring. We need constitutional optionality, protecting civil liberties and pushing back against automated administrative overreach. And we need technical optionality, ensuring that the development of AI remains open and decentralized, rather than monopolized by a few state-aligned megacorporations.
Because every year that interest rates stay high, every step a government takes toward implementing a CBDC, and every leap in concentrated AI capability raises the cost of turning the ship around.
Right.
The objective is to fight for time, keeping the cost of an authoritarian turnaround prohibitively high.
This raises an important question, and the author specifically points out that the sharpest question isn't whether AI will become the party. It goes right back to the timing crunch of our snowplow. Will AI-driven productivity arrive fast enough and be distributed broadly enough throughout the economy to ease the brutal debt math before the tools of control get permanently hardwired into our money, our identity, and our speech?
That intersection of timing is where all three of these massive systemic forces, the $40 trillion debt, the potential for state tyranny, and the AI revolution, actually collide in the real world.
Yeah, they're not separate issues.
No. We started this deep dive looking at a number on a balance sheet. We learned that the $40 trillion isn't fake money held by a shadowy elite. It is the very real foundation of your mutual funds, your pensions, and the global banking system.
And we examined how the sheer crushing weight of that debt removes the vital slack from our financial system, putting immense pressure on the state to maintain market access at all costs, even if it means resorting to financial repression.
And we explored the theory that this desperate need for financial survival will heavily incentivize governments to utilize emerging AI not just to boost the economy, but as a mechanism for absolute societal control, setting up a generational race between productivity and authoritarianism.
Okay.
So what does this all mean? I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, building directly on the logic of the source material we just unpacked.
Okay.
Let's assume the absolute best-case scenario plays out. Let's say the AI snowplow does arrive fast enough. It generates unprecedented, unimaginable wealth, essentially allowing the United States to completely outgrow this $40 trillion debt burden and save the current financial system from collapse.
That would be the dream.
Right. But here's the question you need to ask yourself. Who will own the AI that bought our freedom? If we successfully dodge the tyranny of a desperate, indebted government, do we simply trade it for total dependence on the private, unaccountable tech labs that currently own the snowplow? If the government doesn't lock us in the cabin, do we just end up paying perpetual rent to the corporation that cleared the snow?
That is a chilling thought.
It's something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the numbers, keep questioning the narratives, and we will see you next time.